talking about that prosecution theme for a minute with our next guest too. And thank you, Matt, for that one. We're going to welcome you back here in just a moment. We're going to talk now with Matt Olson, who is the Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice. Matt has an incredible amount, obviously, of cyber experience, understanding how this threat has evolved over the years. So I'd like to welcome you as we're zooming you in. You know, Brad Christian told me at the beginning, Matt, that you were going to win the best award for best backdrop today. I think he was right.
Well, this is a prop here. This is actually not my office, but it is the place that I can actually have a camera. I can't have a camera in my office, which is in a SCIF. So we have a room set up for events exactly like this one with you all, Suzanne, the Cipher Brief. So I'm really pleased to join you.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for being here. You already know that I want to talk today about the new national security cyber section. But before we do that, Matt, I'd really love to kind of get you to describe the current cyber threat landscape as you see it from your unique perspective at the Department of Justice.
Sure, happy to do so. And it's great to follow Cynthia Kaiser from the FBI and who's such, she, along with the rest of the Bureau's Cyber Division, are such great colleagues for us. We are teammates in taking on this threat. In fact, I'm always reminded when I talk about this, I always have to reflect back. I mean, I don't have to reflect back long to an hour and a half ago when I was sitting getting the Presidential Daily Brief along with the FBI Director and DOJ leadership. I would say the Attorney General was not here this morning because he had another place he has to be, which is today he's testifying in Congress. So we're up. We have some pretty stiff competition for this event because at least those who follow the DOJ are probably watching the Attorney General right now live in his testimony. But the point being that every morning, we get the daily brief from the intelligence community, which includes a briefing from the FBI and the FBI senior leaders, including those who oversee their cyber program. And it comes as no surprise to this group that what we're seeing from hostile nation states, which is the area of concern for us in our security division, is that their use of cyber-enabled means to carry out threats and to advance their interests are growing in intensity and as well as in complexity. And their activities cover a wide range of nefarious activities, from stealing sensitive technology, stealing our trade secrets, stealing personally identifiable information of Americans, exerting malign influence within the United States, trying to influence our policy in covert ways, really exporting repression, what we call transnational repression, going after dissidents of authoritarian countries. And then finally, and maybe most concerningly, holding our critical infrastructure at risk to both destructive as well as disruptive attacks. If you look kind of across the nation states that we're most concerned about, Suzanne, and this has largely been declassified, or it has been declassified, I should be clear, but you think about China and what it has done to demonstrate its capability of launching cyber attacks that really could disrupt our critical infrastructure. We know that China has compromised telecommunications firms, and it has conducted cyber attacks that targeted the flow of information, including the speech of dissidents here in the United States. Russia is bolstering its capabilities here as well. It has demonstrated its ability to compromise critical infrastructure, including industrial control systems, and that we think is in part to demonstrate its ability to inflict damage during a conflict or crisis, and that's obviously very concerning. And then, beyond China and Russia, Iran and North Korea continue to be concerns. Iran has been an aggressive cyber actor and has taken really advantage of what we've been talking about in terms of the asymmetric nature of cyber attacks. And then North Korea has used cyber-enabled means to support its weapons program. So across the board, we're seeing these adversaries of ours use cyber-enabled means to, again, inflict, or advance their goals and to threaten us as well as, against the backdrop, to make matters worse, these countries often act as safe havens for those who are simply acting to advance criminal means, right? So these countries are often safe havens. So it's a very challenging landscape. It is a constant source of concern, I know, for the Bureau and for us at DOJ, as well as the rest of the intelligence community. I will say, I think, having been in this space, going back to my time, when I was the general counsel of NSA over a decade ago, when we were really sort of, in the time frame of cyber, at the early stages of organizing the federal government, we have made a significant amount of progress of being much better organized and much better coordinated in understanding the threat and, develop playbooks to address that threat. So I think that's on the good news side.
That's really interesting to hear from you. And a lot of the things that you mentioned are scary when you read them in the headlines. The critical infrastructure. I mean, all of this stuff we're sort of reading piecemeal about in headlines here and there. But the question is always, what is the government doing about it? And I wonder, Matt, if you wouldn't mind just talking for a few minutes about what DOJ's role is in responding to a lot of these threats that you laid out.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's exactly the right way to sort of pivot this conversation, because, as I said, look, the landscape is varied and complicated. But I do think, as a federal government, we are working really well together to use the authorities that we have across the different departments and agencies to confront these threats. And so for us at the Department of Justice, we are prosecutors and investigators. So we have our typical tools, include prosecuting cases, bringing federal charges against cyber actors who violate federal law. And that's obviously one part of our strategy. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we've done there. But I think that what I'd like to emphasize with this group, with you all, is the ways in which we've sort of pivoted a bit, again, working really closely with the FBI, and hats off to them, to be more proactive. The criminal law is really set up to be somewhat reactive, right? There's a crime, we investigate it, we find out who's responsible, and we bring them to justice. That's the model on the criminal side. That works in some cases with cyber, but ideally, when it comes to cyber threats, we're on our front feet and we're positioned to actually stop these threats before they become manifest. And we have to think creatively in what tools we have, legal tools, along with the FBI's technical and investigative capabilities to do that. And so that's kind of been where I think we put a lot of our effort over the past few years. And I've got some examples of that and that I'll talk about in a moment. But I think the third, if I prosecution, being proactive, those are two examples. And I think the third sort of area or line of effort is around being good partners. So, how do we become strong partners with, particularly not just within the federal government, but around the world with foreign governments, as well as, and again, this is, I know, a huge theme for this group, is with the private sector. Different from counterterrorism, right? Where private sector is a part of it, the story, but really when it comes to cyber, obviously, it is front and center and it's on the front lines of the threat. So how do we become good partners? So those are our three lines of effort: prosecution, proactive disruption, and strong partnerships. But where I want to focus, if I could just take another moment or two, is the ways in which we've tried to be more proactive in disrupting threats. One of the things that we've done is to use what we call, court-authorized search and seizure authority to dismantle hacking infrastructure and those networks that are connected to hostile nation-state adversaries. And so what do I mean by, court-ordered search and seizure authority? So if you think about a typical criminal case, a bank robbery or something like that, we have the authority to go to a court and ask for the court to say to the government, to the federal government, we can do a search of the suspect's house or the location where the crime occurred to gather evidence. Well, take that analogy and apply that same idea to the cyber context. We have the authority, and we've used it in a number of high-profile cases, to ask the court for permission to go into cyber infrastructure that's been used to carry out a crime. That is, some sort of hacking crime. And that authority can include the authority to seize the instruments of that crime. In this case, it's not like the crowbar that was used to open the window where a burglary occurred, but rather than the crowbar, it is the malicious code that was used to enable a cyber attack or some type of malicious cyber activity. If that sort of analogy makes sense, it's actually something that we've argued and successfully been able to convince courts to authorize us to do on a number of occasions. And I think, again, that sort of innovative way of using the law in the cyber context, I think, has paid dividends. A couple of examples, one quite recent from this past May, where with the FBI, we neutralized a Russian intelligence malware implant. This was the FSB, used an implant that they had called the Snake, and it had been among their most successful malware implants historically, going back years, to steal information. And they had used it to take sensitive documents from hundreds of computers in, I think, over 50 countries. And we used our authority to go in and dismantle that malware and make it so it's basically ineffective at this point. A similar operation back a year ago, just over a year ago, after the invasion of Ukraine, we disrupted the GRU, again, the Russian military intelligence ability to take use a botnet that they were trying to use to take control of thousands of devices around the world. And we were able to copy and then remove the malware known as Cyclops Blink from the botnet's command and control, and basically sever the command and control nodes from the botnet, making that botnet ineffective. So those are a couple of more relatively recent examples. Going back to 2021, a couple of years ago, we worked in a similar fashion to go after the vulnerability in the Microsoft Exchange server. And that was another example of where we were able to remove malicious web shells from hundreds of computers that were vulnerable. And I think it's important to our private sector partners who may be on the line, or generally speaking, aware of this, that we work really closely with them. One of the first things we'll do is we'll work with the private sector to put out notices. We work with DHS and CISA to put out notices. Here's a vulnerability. We work with particular companies we've identified that may have already been hacked, and we get their permission to take steps, or we advise them what steps they need to take to protect themselves. And then as a final step, we know, like for example, in the Microsoft case, we ultimately take our own proactive steps to protect those vulnerable systems or networks. And again, the point is that we're not just waiting to prosecute, right? We're not just waiting to find individuals and bring them to court, but rather taking steps proactively. And I think this is something I hope to continue to see along with the Bureau, us, work in this area to take these types of proactive steps.
I think that's really interesting, and I do think that's something that the general public doesn't really have a grasp of. So it's fascinating to hear you lay this out in this way. Let me ask you about the new national security cyber section. We might be having a small glitch. Can you hear me okay?
I can now. I just got the very beginning of your question.
Okay, let me cyber section, what it is and what you're hoping it's going to be able to do at DOJ.
Sure, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. We started this new section earlier this year, and the idea, we call it NatSec Cyber, just for those who want to be in the know and seem really cool when they talk about it. But it is the case that, look, we've been working on cyber threats, since they came on the landscape. And we had done so, with a small cadre of prosecutors within our counter-espionage and the same prosecutors who work on counter-espionage and export control. And as that threat has grown, it's been clear that we needed to really get to me and to my colleagues, that we needed to dedicate a cadre of experienced and dedicated prosecutors to this challenge. At the Department of Justice, we did a comprehensive cyber review last year. The White House released its national cybersecurity strategy this year. So those two reviews really highlighted the importance of the cyber threat and the sort of all government approach that we needed to take to address it. And one of the things I think it's important for folks to understand is, look, these are hard cases. I talked about some of the disruptions we've been doing. This requires a level of commitment of resources, a level of expertise, working really closely with the intelligence community, that is, and sometimes they take time. They're not going to happen overnight, right? We needed to sort of have all of that expertise and know-how into one section that would be able to ultimately devote the time and attention to the nature of the threat, along with just the general recognition that the threat, as I said at the top, has become more challenging and more complex. So we've done a great job, I think, with a handful of folks, but I thought, and folks agreed with me, that we could do more just in terms of horsepower, organizational structure, and also visibility within the department. One of the key things about this group is that they work really closely with our colleagues in the criminal division. So a little inside baseball, I run the national security division. There's another division at DOJ called the criminal division, which has a computer crimes and intellectual property section known as CCIPS that has been around a long time. It's a great group of prosecutors, and we sort of divide up the cyber threat world between criminal actors in the criminal division, nation state actors, where we have that responsibility. But there's obviously, just saying that, demonstrates that there's a fluid sort of distinction that we need to work really closely to sometimes reconcile how we handle those cases. So look, ultimately with that coordination, we are able to have this one section, NatSec Cyber, that has increased. I've already seen it, the speed and scale of our disruption campaigns and our prosecutions across the board. So yeah, more to come from this section. It's really just got stood up a couple months ago and announced it, I think, back in April. And yeah, I look forward to great things from them.
I'm really interested to hear more about that, because I think what we're seeing across the board, and especially in the private sector as well and in the boardrooms, is just there needs to be a deeper understanding, more expertise around cyber in order to be able to address it in the way that's needed. And it's interesting to hear from your perspective how DOJ is managing that with this new national security cyber section. I'm wondering if I could get in the weeds just a little bit with you, and not too much, but I'd really love to know how you're seeing DOJ's efforts and how you're deconflicting with other government agencies, because I think for a long time, Matt, the issue has really been there are so many different entities within government tackling so many different things. It's confusing from the outside to really know what's going on, maybe sometimes from the inside as well. So how are you looking at deconflicting so that these new efforts run as efficiently as possible?
I mean, it's a great question, Suzanne. It is part of the challenge in an area like this, where it's a threat area that is, again, relatively new. We've been doing this for over a decade, but like, how do you make sure that the threat is outpacing in a lot of ways our response capabilities and is evolving very quickly? So how do you continue to adapt on the response side in a way that we are working in harmony? I will say, look, as I mentioned, I was at NSA over a decade ago. I saw NSA's capabilities firsthand in that role. I was the director at the National Counterterrorism Center. While not a cyber-focused job, it was a job that kind of gave me the inside view of how you take a really hard problem like counterterrorism and organize the government effectively and in a synchronized way to take on that challenge. And that was kind of one of the main reasons why NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, was established, was to help organize and ensure unity of effort across the counterterrorism landscape. And some of those lessons, we've learned from 9/11 and CT, we can apply in the cyber context. That is, sharing of information, using all the tools that we have for each department and agency, working closely not just with federal partners, but with international partners. And I've seen some of those lessons applied in the cyber context and bear fruit. And one of the ways in which I've seen it within DOJ, I mentioned our close coordination with our partners within DOJ. We also are working very closely with CISA and when we do an operation that's coordinated closely in terms of public messaging, and CISA's work with the private sector. We work really closely with Treasury in some of the cases we brought, for example, involving North Korea and recovering stolen ransomware and cryptocurrency, and making sure that we're using Treasury sanctions authorities to sort of double hit some of these actors. And then just on the policy side, we're really well latched up with the National Security Council and how we are positioning, the policy-making apparatus to understand the nature of the threat, as well as DOJ's role. And a very specific example is what we're doing. We have a liaison, NSD does, at U.S. Cyber Command. Pretty unusual for there to be an a DOJ lawyer in a combatant command, sitting there with the Cyber Command operators. But that helps us make sure that mission packages that come out of Cyber Command are well coordinated with the FBI and with DOJ, and because in some cases we have investigative equities as well as sort of some policymaking insights that give us some ability to contribute to the overall government effort. So I think it's a great question. It's where I spend a lot of my time focusing how we are managing that sort of deconfliction. And deconfliction is the right word, but it's also more broad, right? It's not just making sure we're not at odds with each other, but more positively stated, it's an effort to make sure that we are well coordinated and harmonized in our overall efforts.
Yeah, I like that. Efficiency is my favorite word.
Yeah.
We need more of it across the board in government and in the private sector and at home. I'm curious. I think I'd like to shift gears for just a quick minute, and it's somewhat related, but a little different, and that is to talk about Section 702. I know that that's an issue that's very near and dear to your heart. You've been through the reauthorization of 702 a couple of times now. This, of course, gives the government different authorities to use information in order to keep the nation safe. I'm wondering how you're feeling about Section 702 as we get closer to a vote on whether or not that's going to be reauthorized later this year.
Yeah, well, look, I really have to thank you for giving me the opportunity to get up on a soapbox a little bit with this really well-informed group. And I don't assume that everyone's tracking this, certainly not as closely as I am and folks here at DOJ are. But I mean, Section 702 is part of FISA. It was passed in 2008, the first time it's been reauthorized twice since then. I said before when I testified in Congress about this in June, I firmly believe this is the single most significant decision that Congress will make in the national security realm this year, and and that seems only more true given the latest things that we've been able to talk about in how 702 is used to protect the country. It basically is a law that allows us to conduct foreign intelligence surveillance of non-U.S. persons overseas who are using U.S. infrastructure like email and internet service providers here in a way that it gives us the speed and agility to move quickly from target to target and go up on them quickly. And in no context is that more important, as we've seen, than in the cyber context. It was passed in 2008 when Al-Qaeda was the primary use case and what we talked about. But today, look, it's a tool, it's an authority that spans threats. So it includes CT, of course, but now we're using it to go after China and the threat from China. We're using it even in the counter-narcotic space, but in particular for your audience now, we've used it really effectively to counter cyber threats. Where we have someone outside the United States who's not a U.S. person, but we have reason to believe has foreign intelligence about cyber threats. Think about somebody in China who's managing some sort of malicious activity from China. We can target that person and gain foreign intelligence about what they're doing. And we did declassify a couple of examples recently. In one, I was able to talk about the fact that we use 702 and what an important role it played in the Colonial Pipeline attack. Very significant and notorious cyber attack back in 2021, a ransomware attack. We used it to acquire information about the identity of the hacker. That's huge, as well as we got information that enabled the U.S. government to recover a substantial portion of the ransom that had been paid. And then in a second case that we declassified, again, we're very careful about how we talk about this because of the sensitivity of the sources and methods here. But we used it to successfully identify and mitigate an Iranian ransomware attack against a nonprofit organization in 2022. In that case, within a week, because of 702, we were able to respond to that attack, mitigate it, and ultimately recover the information that belonged to that organization without paying a ransom. This is a tool, I should add, that is NSA is sort of front and center on the targeting decision making, but a lot of the information, or at least a portion of the information, is shared with other government agencies, including the FBI. And from where I sit at DOJ, it's really critical for the FBI to have that access, because at the end of the day, while we're collecting information about non-US persons outside the US, those threats often manifest inside the US, whether that's a US person or in many cases in the cyber context, a US company. And our ability to protect those US entities really depends on the FBI's ability, because it's the one intelligence agency, of course, with the law enforcement authorities to operate inside the country. And one of the controversies we're facing in this debate involves how the FBI has used 702 information. They've made some serious mistakes. There have been a range of compliance problems with how the FBI has used 702, and that's been an issue in the reauthorization debate. We've taken some big steps to address those. I think we've largely done so. I think we've made some, your question is sort of where are we in this debate? I mean, I think we've made a lot of progress with Congress. We've had many briefings for Congress as well as staffers, ranging from this is sort of 702, 101, just giving you the basics, to those who are very familiar with the program, how it's worked. And I think we've generally been able to be persuasive on the overall value of 702. I am concerned that some of the reform proposals would sort of undermine its effectiveness as a tool. So we're working really hard to persuade Congress that we've taken those steps that we need to take to address those concerns. We're willing to do more if there are some solid ideas that are on the table that will both address the issues that we've had in this program, as well as, but at the same time preserve its efficacy. So I don't know if there's anybody on here from who works for a member of Congress, or who knows a member of Congress, or married to a member of Congress. But if you have any questions, reach out to me. And my colleagues who are working so hard to get this done. Like, if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk about this further.
Yeah, I think traditionally, I just want to stay on this topic for a moment, because traditionally we've thought about 702 and its use when it comes to counterterrorism efforts. I mean, it largely after 9/11, that was, a big justification for being able to have some of these new authorities. I'm really interested in the trend now toward being able to use it in cyber. And I'm interested in your kind of projection on how 702 will continue to do a good job, as you're arguing, for government in the future, as you see these cyber threats continue to evolve. They're more complicated than ever. How do you see that trajectory in using 702 for cyber efforts in the future going?
Look, I am not at all hesitant to say I think it's going to be, 702 will only grow in importance when it comes to cyber threats. I can sort of give a hypothetical example. I gave some specific examples like Colonial Pipeline, but just imagine again, one of these, say a Russian GRU attack that is targeting US-based critical infrastructure. And we know that it's targeting, we know from reporting, say, from that company, a company that's been targeted, that they're seeing this Russian malware, right? And maybe we work with a private sector company like CrowdStrike or another to sort of help us understand the nature of that threat. Well, it's all, in all likelihood, again, this is all hypothetical, but in all likelihood, that GRU malware is not just targeting that one oil company or that one water supply company, but multiple in that sector. So we can use indicators like what are they doing? Like, what are some of the indicators of where they're targeting? And we can use those to search in the data we've already collected, right? So that we can see if it's hitting this IP address, maybe it's hitting these other IP addresses. And that will let us know, at the speed that we need to know it, days, if not even hours, how significant is this threat? What's the scope of it? Is it isolated? Who does it go back to? Does it go back to other actors? Who can we identify within within, say, this foreign country like Russia and Russian-based actors. And that is how then we can work again with our partners to warn these companies and to take steps to mitigate that threat. Like again, to be really clear, that's a hypothetical, but it's not a far-fetched one. It's one I foresee happening with increasing frequency, where Section 702 is really the single authority we have to disrupt that threat at the speed that it's occurring. There's not an alternative. It's not like we can't turn to other sources that have the same capability to move as quickly and as effectively across the foreign landscape to help us understand the nature of those threats. So that's why I think the stakes are so high.
I think you've done a good job of laying out just we can imply what would happen if you lost that authority. So I think you've done a great job of laying that out. Let me get to just a couple of questions if you have a few more minutes for us here from some of our guests who are joining us virtually. Jeff Selding says, to what extent are you seeing adversaries, especially China, make use of AI in their various attacks against the US? And what inroads are China, Russia, and Iran and North Korea, for that matter, making and using technology like AI? How much of that's getting through to your office, Matt?
Well, let me say generally, I think that, and this is not going to be, Jeff, not a surprise, but obviously our adversaries are using the same tools and capabilities that to go after us as we are, seeing being developed that we can use to defend ourselves, right? Like advances in technology, whether it's, processing power of computers or certainly artificial intelligence and machine learning. These are things that can be helpful, right? In the cyber defense context, understanding the nature of, are there anomalous, indicators within networks that help us understand if there's a threat. And obviously those same capabilities are available to our adversaries. It's quite obviously sort of out there already, like the way AI could advance phishing campaigns, for example, to make them more effective. So I think it's something that we need to be really concerned about. But it's always going to be, this is the nature of cyber and the nature of national security more generally, is that there's kind of this technological race that's always occurring. Can we develop our defenses as fast as our adversaries are developing their offensive capabilities? And AI is just the latest frontier in that.
Yeah. Let me come full circle and go back to, you did such a great job off the top of the conversation, kind of laying out the threats as you see them from your perspective. And coming back with a question on China, because I think what we're going to hear later today in a few of our sessions from our private sector partners as well, is that we're seeing changes in behavior in China. We're seeing more aggressive behavior in cyber. We're seeing China learn and adapt very quickly. I'm curious if you can just kind of give us one more quick review of what you're seeing in terms of cyber activity on behalf of China and why it's concerning you from the position of being inside the US government.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to, because it's, I think the Director of National Intelligence has made this point, Director Wray of the FBI has made this point, there's no more sort of persistent and capable malicious cyber actor than China. And I described across, the range of activities, whether that's stealing our intellectual property and theft of trade secrets from companies, to transnational repression that is using cyber-enabled means to suppress dissidents here in the United States, all the way to the potential disruption or destruction of critical infrastructure here in the U.S. by the PRC. And I think across all of those sort of vectors, we're very concerned because of China's capabilities, and in particular, while they do have strong capabilities and they also have enormous resources. I think if you talk to Director Wray, he'll point to just the amount of money and manpower that they put behind their cyber capabilities. So there's ways in which Iran and Russia have been targeted and also can be sophisticated, but just in terms of sheer scale and persistence, I think China sort of stands alone. And why I think we're rightly very concerned about making sure that we're taking steps to confront them in a number of ways. But one way that, again, sort of coming back home to us at DOJ, we brought cases where we've called out, Chinese PRC intelligence actors for their activities going after dissidents here in the United States. Something that we are very concerned about because, again, people in the United States enjoy freedoms, whether they're US citizens or not. They're here, they have the rights that are protected by our First Amendment to speak their mind, to associate with whom they wish politically, and we see China going after them because they're perceived as dissidents, and that's something that we've prosecuted and intelligence officers for, as well as on the straight cyber side, stealing intellectual property, for example. We've announced some prosecutions in that context as well against PRC actors. So we are, where we can, taking those steps to investigate and prosecute, because there's a lot, like, look, I'm bullish on the role that the Department of Justice plays here, and I'll say, for folks who are listening, there's something very important and unique about the role that we play when we can announce an indictment that says, here are the charges, and here's the evidence we have. And here's what we are prepared to go into an open court and prove against you. This is not, I mean, diplomacy has its role, intelligence, of course, has its role, but in terms of the public narrative, like, we can really advance that public narrative by demonstrating our willingness to prove charges based on facts and evidence against, for example, in this case, PRC actors who are taking steps to threaten us, whether it's our values and the First Amendment or our information and our economic security and competitiveness. We are not going to tolerate that, and we're going to prosecute that activity whenever we have the evidence to support those cases.
Yeah. I think it's a really great, again, going back to the question of, we kind of know what's happening. We get a lot of that from the intelligence community and other government partners, but the what are we doing about it really kind of sits with you oftentimes. So that's a great responsibility, and it's interesting to hear just from you over the last, half an hour or so, how the division is organizing against it, how you see the top threats and what you see coming in the future. Any closing thoughts to leave us with?
No, well, look, I just want to say, like, it's great to be here with you, Suzanne. We've done some version of this, you and I, a few times over the years, but this group and the Cipher Brief audience is such a sophisticated and thoughtful audience, and the opportunity to address you all, to talk about, look, the work that we do every day, and I here just am here kind of representing, right, all the prosecutors and to some degree the FBI as well, who are on the front lines conducting these investigations. But one of the points I guess I would close with just is the importance of the close relationships that we've forged with the private sector, who are so much on the front lines here, and where we want to continue to build on those relationships, where fundamentally, are founded on the trust that we are really seeking hard to earn and keep, whether it's in 702 or in this context of working closely to protect companies that are facing these threats.
Yeah, I think I would, well, thanks for bringing up that we've known each other for a while, more than a decade now, I think, and we're both a little bit older and hopefully a little bit wiser. But I do think that close partnership between the public and private sectors is something that I have seen change in ways I wouldn't have imagined back then. And it's only going to have to change more in the future and become closer. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later today too. Matt Olson, Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice. We want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day. We know how busy you are to share this with our audience. I think it's been a very insightful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.